Poor people who have dated rich people, what did you learn? They don't really have a concept of how rich they are. My ex-boyfriend was wealthy, but had a complex about how he was super poor. It was because all of his friends were also so wealthy, and he was maybe marginally less rich than some of them. He considered himself on the lower end of the scale. They don't really have a point of reference for how poor some people are. When we were together, I was living on a food budget of £50 a month, and he absolutely could not wrap his head around how a person could spend that little. I also lived with a horrendously rich friend. His family are aristocracy in his home country. One thing I've noticed about him is that he's completely incapable of grasping that if I stop working, I just stop being able to eat. He was confused about why I was worried about taking a week off work, and didn't understand I was worried I'd lose money. He seemed to think that most people work because they choose to, because he's never had to work. My ex was having problems with roommates at university. Her parents bought a $300,000 condo for her to stay at while she finished her degree, 2 years. They sold it for a profit immediately after. I can't imagine not only being able to solve my problems with money, let alone make more off of them. She also assumed her family was lower middle class because she didn't live in a mansion like her friends. She was very humble and was smart with her money, but it was very clear she could just call her parents if something didn't work out. Meanwhile, my parents were struggling to pay rent, meaning I was their fallback. Not the other way around. I've thought about this a lot as someone who grew up poor, but has been in a number of relationships with women from upper or upper middle class castes. I think what it boils down to is that they have a kind of certainty in the idea that things will work out for them that I don't. Growing up, it felt like we were always at the precipice of catastrophe. I always felt that one wrong move would result in us losing our house or all of our money. As such, I kept immaculate care of things that I bought, knowing that I could not replace any of it if it were gone. The women I've been in relationships with, though, seem to have none of this fear. They always assume that things will work out. Plans don't need to be made because there's always some way to solve a problem with money. Objects don't get much respect because they're always readily replaceable. I always think about Nick Carraway's quote from The Great Gatsby. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. Dated a girl for 3 years who came from old money. She was fine, but her family was beyond out of touch with the real world. They were nice people but incredibly removed from the rest of the world. They looked at me like I was a zoo animal in the sense that they were so curious about my life/family. They'd ask me what it was like going to public school. How my parents immigrated. They were baffled that not everyone had vacation homes or traveled a lot. The most interesting thing is that old money is much more powerful than new money. They belong to these clubs that consists of other rich families, and the influence they had was mind-blowing. Want to build a factory in an area not zoned for it? Within a week that was changed. My ex-wife had a grandfather that was a multimillionaire. Christmas time at their house was like being in another world. All of the different family members would try to get a moment with the king and kissed ass as much as possible. I spent my time down on the ground playing with my kids and was happy to get out of there. About a week or two after the second Christmas, I got a phone call from Grandpa. He wanted to know what he could do for my family. I told him I didn't want any of his money, but I would like my kids to know their great-grandfather. Later that year he showed up at our place unexpected and spent most of the afternoon telling stories with me about his youth. He set up a trust fund for each one of my kids to have their college paid for a little bit after that. He told me out of all of his in-laws I was the only one that never asked him for anything but to be himself. I'm a guy who has dated women considerably wealthier than myself. My experience is that money becomes a factor sooner or later, no matter how closely you've connected on every other level. Even when the lady in question seems cool with it, there can be arch looks and withering comments from friends and family in social settings, about what you've just ordered for dinner, or what your holiday plans are. In those relationships I've ended up being made to feel like a bottleneck. I'm either the person who the woman spends money on more than vice versa, or the person whose income puts more restraint on evenly shared expenditure than would otherwise be the case. In either scenario, there's pressure, and even if the woman seems fine with it, there are people around her who no doubt would claim they're just looking out for her, who will cheerfully flag every instance where the difference in income is apparent. Money doesn't have to warp people, but it seems it often does, whether it's actually their own money or not. Grew up poor, now middle class, and at 18 dated a super rich guy. First thing I noticed was the food. Not just quantities, but I also discovered so much food, like oyster, fresh fish, olives, things my parents could never buy. I also had to learn etiquette. My parents brought me up well, I read books all the time, was a decent student and well-behaved kid. But the way his family interacted was so different. I had to learn a lot of unwritten rules that I wasn't aware of. I think in the end what I actually learned was that even though my childhood was rough, the amount of stress of not having enough money has probably impacted me for life. I valued my parents so much more. Once I had seen what life was like for rich people, I was just so proud of my family for making it work with so much less. Well, I wasn't that poor, and she wasn't that rich, but it was enough of a difference that I was shocked at how often she just took planes. Like, she flew more in a summer than I had my whole life. That, and apparently they go to Hawaii for a week every year, which was fun the time I got to tag along, but it's pretty wild to me that they can just do that. Even if I could afford it, I don't have enough vacation time to do that every year. I dated a girl from old money, generational inherited wealth. Grandpa's money, some corporate bigwig banker or something to that effect. I don't think her father ever worked a day in his life, and her mother clearly came from money as well. Outside of her, I found every one of her family members out of touch and completely unrelatable. I got real good at biting my tongue when my ex's siblings would complain about not getting a new car for their birthday when last year's model is sitting in the driveway. They had no concept of the value of money and never had to do anything for themselves to get what they wanted. I wasn't exactly poor growing up, but for the most part if it wasn't strictly necessary for survival I didn't have it. It was really eye-opening how everything was taken for granted. Those specific people would be helpless in the real world if they lost all their dough. An acquaintance, actually the aunt of the spouse of a family member of mine, worked as a maid, while putting herself through school, to a super wealthy and famous family in a foreign country. They had it all. They spent like no tomorrow, just assuming it would always be there. The dad/granddad was a businessman and I guess was most well known as the owner of a sports team. This aunt acquaintance was basically told to keep her opinions to herself and just do the work. So she mostly did. She knew everything about that family. One of the grown adult grandkids didn't work. He just lived off the family. His pastime was napping. She was told to keep some of the cleaning noise down when he was napping. Anyways, I'm not sure what happened, but the whole thing completely unraveled when the patriarch passed away and I guess there were a bunch of debts he had been just shifting money around to keep at bay. When things went south she bought furniture off them for pennies on the dollar and furnished her new place real nice. I guess the kids were able to keep their trust funds or something, but they lost all the real estate and fancy amenities. Anyways, the bottom line is that she rents out a studio apartment to that guy who just likes to sleep. Looks like he's just running down his trust fund. She feels bad for the guy, can't convince him to get a job. Mine's a bit on the positive side I guess. I grew up dirt poor and I guess got to a point where I couldn't dream big. My family is still poor. I dated a guy who not only was a trust fund baby but he also had a job as chief engineer and was making over $250K a year from that job. He didn't need the money. I was making $70K. He'd organize spontaneous holidays overseas and fun weekend activities that cost money. Told me to leave my card at home. Then in the short time we dated, he coached me into how to get a better paying job. Helped me learn and understand my worth and the value of my education and experience. While dating him I quit my $70K job and landed a $100K one, then broke into the $200,000s a few years later. Now I have money and can take my parents and siblings on holiday as well as put my siblings through university and help them out. Some of them are pretty down to earth. I dated a woman who was the daughter of a near billionaire. I had no idea for a while. I took her to a museum with a $35 ticket price and for pizza on our first date and she thought that was too extravagant. Admittedly, it's more than I normally planned for a first date but I was super into her and she mentioned really liking in the artist behind the museum. She did live in a ridiculously expensive condo and not work but she had a chronic illness that made school and work very difficult for her. It was certainly a lesson on how differently disability affects people with and without money. Her illness was actually a mystery. Doctors couldn't diagnose it. So she tried to get an appointment at the Mayo Clinic. They said there was a 6-month wait. Her father called them and mentioned how his company handled their pension plan. She flew there a few days later and was quickly diagnosed. Her parents' home was huge and filled with original and custom artworks, including from the artist whose museum we visited. It was really weird walking into that level of excessive wealth. I'm not poor, but I dated a guy for 4 years that had a wildly wealthy father. Private jets, extremely expensive cars, giant homes, paid for his children's veneer/plastic surgeries, employed them all, etc. They were the most miserable, unhappy people I've ever had the displeasure of being around. It completely changed my view of the very rich and the facade they put on. Not a single interaction with his family was without a fight, argument, screaming match, and jab/cruelty towards one another and myself. I was so uncomfortable around them, and my ex was so obsessed with pleasing his father that I had to end the relationship. The money was nice, but I would absolutely never, ever willingly associate with any of them again. They were terrible people. Very unhappy.